She cried out through the iron that cut her wrists raw, "Mama said you'd save me." He had not heard his own name spoken in years, yet when the mountain man turned, he found a child chained and trembling, her eyes wide with desperate faith. His arms opened before his heart even knew why. The chains rattled like angry snakes in the dusk, their harsh clinking louder than the whip of wind that stirred the pines. Gideon Holt, a man who had chosen silence and solitude high in the ridges, froze as the voice tore through him. He had gone down into the valley for nothing more than salt and a sack of flour, yet here, where the trail cut close to the abandoned mining shacks, he found her. A girl no older than 7, her dress torn, her cheeks hollowed, her lips split from thirst. Her arms trembled as she lifted them toward him, shackles heavy on her thin frame. And though Gideon had faced storms that tore cabins from their posts and wolves that hunted men as if they were deer, nothing in all his years struck him harder than the sight of this child clinging to hope as if it were breath itself. His first step cracked the silence, boots grinding against frozen dirt. The girl flinched, shrinking back against the splintered beam that held her captive. Yet even as fear flickered in her eyes, her words trembled again, as if reciting a promise handed down from lips she trusted more than her own heartbeat. "Mama said you'd save me. She said you would come." Her voice broke on the last word, so soft and hoarse that Gideon nearly thought it was the whisper of wind. But no, this was no ghost. This was a child carved from suffering, left where no one would dare to look. Gideon knelt slowly, lowering himself to her eye level, his massive hands trembling despite the years of iron control. He saw then that she bore bruises in shapes no child should ever carry. The chain bit into her ankles, rubbed her skin raw. Yet she clutched a torn scrap of fabric pressed against her chest, a bit of faded calico, worn soft, clearly once part of a woman's dress. Her thumb rubbed it again and again, the way a soul rubs a prayer bead. "Mama said," she repeated, eyes shining through dirt and tears, "you'd come." A storm rolled in Gideon's chest. For years, he had buried himself in the high country to escape the ruin of his own family, to drown the memory of graves he could not unsee. He had sworn never to take on another soul, never to open the door of his heart again. But the sight of her, the raw faith, the chains, the whisper of a mother who had clearly given her last breath promising deliverance, undid him. His arms reached before his will caught up, strong hands closing around iron links. With a growl born not of anger but of breaking silence, he pulled. Rust screamed, the chain straining, and still he pulled until his muscles burned, until the beam cracked, until iron bent. The girl sobbed out loud, her knees giving way as freedom pulled her forward. Gideon caught her against his chest before she struck the ground. She fit there as if she had always belonged, small and trembling, clutching that torn scrap to her cheek. He held her, and though his eyes had not known tears in decades, they burned hot and heavy now, spilling as the weight of it all pressed down. For in that moment, Gideon Holt, the man the mountains had claimed, wept openly for the first time since burying his wife and son. But even as his heart broke open, the earth reminded him that mercy never came cheap. A snap echoed from the ridge, the distinct sound of a rifle's safety pulled back. Gideon turned sharply, his body instinctively sheltering the girl. Shadows shifted among the rocks above. The chain had not been left by accident. No child had been abandoned here by fate alone. This was bait, a cruel snare laid not for beasts but for men. The girl's small hands clung tighter to his coat. "Don't let them take me back," she begged, voice no louder than breath against his collar, her plea cut deeper than the iron ever could. Gideon's jaw clenched. He could already feel unseen eyes trained on his every move, waiting to strike. He adjusted his stance, wide and steady, shielding her with his frame. Whatever lay ahead, he would not step back. He had been given a charge far holier than his own life, the promise of a mother's last words carried in a child's faith. The wind grew sharp, a horse snorted above the ridge, then a voice, smooth and cruel, rolled down like thunder. "Step away from the girl, mountain man. She don't belong to you." The voice carried down the slope with a confidence that had nothing to do with righteousness and everything to do with power long abused. Gideon's back stiffened, his breath steadying as he tightened his hold on the girl. Her small frame trembled against his chest, but she made no sound now, no cry, no whimper, only silence, as if she knew sound itself could call down further cruelty. Gideon slowly turned his body, keeping her pressed into the shelter of his arms while his eyes scanned the ridge. There they were. 3 riders, their horses restless in the failing light, steam curling from flared nostrils. Men dressed not like drifters or miners, but like men who lived on the back of fear. Long coats, polished boots caked in dust, rifles too fine for the hills they prowled. The one in the center dismounted with deliberate ease, boots crunching into gravel. His hat was broad-brimmed, shadowing a face that carried a smirk too practiced to be real. His voice slithered down again. "That girl belongs to us." He spoke the word belongs as if it was natural, as if she were no more than a possession left lying on the trail. Gideon felt the child's fingers tighten into his coat, digging deep as though she feared being ripped from him that very instant. He angled his stance, placing one foot back, weight balanced, ready. "You'll not take her," Gideon said. His voice was gravel itself, low and firm, years of silence now turned into a wall of unshakable steel. The man tilted his head, amused. Mountain folk always think they can fight the tide, but tides don't listen. Hold. The sound of his name made Gideon's muscles coil tight. Whoever these men were, they had done their homework. That was no accident either. He had buried his past high in these ridges, and yet somehow it had been dug up, dragged into the light. He forced the thought aside. One thing at a time, protect the child. The man gestured casually, and one of the other riders shifted his rifle across his saddle, the barrel catching the dim light. The message was clear. One wrong move and the girl would pay the price. Gideon crouched slightly, lowering his face close to the girl's ear. "Close your eyes," he whispered. She obeyed instantly, pressing her forehead into his chest, clutching the calico scrap with all her strength. "Who was her mother?" Gideon asked suddenly, voice cutting through the tension. The man's smirk faltered just slightly. For the briefest moment his gaze flicked to the girl, then back to Gideon. A shadow of annoyance crossed his features, like a poker player forced to show his hand too early. "Doesn't matter," he said coldly. "She's ours now." Gideon's breath hissed between his teeth. He had heard enough. In that one sentence lay all he needed to know. This was no matter of law or family. This was a theft of flesh and blood, a crime carved into the child's very bones. These were men who profited off of chains, who saw no difference between cattle and a 7-year-old girl with eyes too old for her years. He shifted the girl higher against his chest, feeling her ribs far too sharp through the thin dress. His voice rumbled, steady and final. "She's not yours, she never was." The smirk disappeared now, replaced by a sneer. "Then you've just bought yourself a grave. Hold." The man snapped his fingers, and the 2 riders on the ridge pulled rifles to their shoulders in unison. The crack of iron sliding into place echoed like thunderclaps in the valley. Gideon moved instantly. He twisted his frame, crouched low, and rolled toward the nearest outcrop of rock, shielding the girl with his body as a shot exploded. The blast tore splinters from the beam where she had been chained only moments before. Her scream was muffled against his chest, but her arms clung tighter, trusting, desperate. They would not get her, not while he drew breath. Gideon reached the cover of stone and pressed the child down gently, keeping his arm locked around her as bullets sparked off the rocks above. His old Winchester lay slung across his back, a weapon he had not fired in anger for years, not since the blood-soaked day that had driven him into exile. But his hands remembered. He swung it forward, the stock pressing familiar against his shoulder. He drew in a breath, slow and deep, steadying himself. The child tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was trembling but strong. "Mama said you'd save me," she whispered again. Gideon looked into her eyes, blue, rimmed with red from tears, yet shining with something unbroken. It cut him deeper than the wind could ever cut. "I will," he promised, his voice rough but sure. "I will." Another shot slammed into the rock, spraying stone chips. Gideon angled his rifle, peering past the edge. The riders were bold but sloppy, too confident in their numbers. He squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed through the valley, and one horse reared as its rider fell backward into the dust. The other men shouted, their formation breaking. The girl flinched at the sound, but Gideon's arm was there, steadying her, shielding her ears as best he could. The leader snarled, his voice twisting with rage. "You'll regret that, Holt. You don't know who you're crossing." But Gideon did know. He knew enough. Men like this had been crawling the frontier for too long, building power on backs too small to resist. He shifted again, another shot tearing from his rifle, forcing the second rider back behind cover. But Gideon's victory was brief. Hoofbeats thundered from farther down the ridge. More riders, the sound rolling like an oncoming storm. The girl whimpered, clutching tighter. Gideon gritted his teeth. They had laid this trap well. He had only moments before the noose tightened fully. His eyes darted to the line of pines edging the trail. If he could make the cover with the child in his arms, they might vanish into the timber, lose themselves in the mountain's endless folds. It was slim, but it was all he had. Gideon slung the rifle back, scooped the girl against him, and with a deep breath, broke from cover. Bullets hissed past, spitting snow and dirt into the air. His boots pounded against the earth, each step a promise carved into the ground. She would not go back into chains. The girl buried her face into his chest, her small hands clinging with all the strength left in her. He could feel her heartbeat racing against his ribs, frantic but alive. He ran harder. The forest loomed ahead, dark and thick. If they could just make it, but the thunder of hooves drew nearer. The leader's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. "Bring him down, don't let him reach the trees." The girl's sob escaped, raw and broken. "Don't let them take me, please." And Gideon Holt, mountain man, exile, fatherless and widowed, surged forward with a fury he thought long buried. For the first time in years, his heart had purpose again, and he would not surrender it to the darkness that stalked them. The trees opened like a waiting mouth, shadows swallowing them whole just as another volley of shots rang out behind. The hunt had only begun. The forest closed around them like a fortress of shadows, swallowing the echoes of gunfire into its dense belly. The pines rose tall and unyielding, their boughs heavy with snow, their trunks pressed tight enough that no rider could charge straight without weaving. Gideon's breath steamed in ragged bursts as he barreled through, his boots crunching over roots and ice. The child clutched tightly to his chest. Her eyes were wide and darting, but she did not cry now. Perhaps she knew silence was her best shield, or perhaps she had simply cried all the tears her young body could spare. Either way, her small heart thudded against his ribs like a sparrow trapped in a cage. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew muddled, horses struggling to weave between trees, men shouting over one another, the crack of a branch snapping under misplaced weight. They were hunters, but the mountains had a way of turning hunters into prey. Gideon had lived long enough among these ridges to know their language. Every hollow, every frozen creek, every ridge was etched into him as surely as scars on his skin. The men behind him might have numbers, but they were strangers here. Strangers bled fast in Gideon's world. He slowed only once they had cleared the first stretch of dense timber. Kneeling low behind a thick log, he pressed the child gently into the hollow between trunk and snow, cupping her face with his rough, frostbitten hands. "Stay low," he whispered. "Don't move till I come for you." Her lip trembled, but she nodded, her fingers still wrapped around that scrap of calico. Her faith, that fragile and impossible faith, clung to him more tightly than her small hands ever could. Gideon rose again, slipping his Winchester free and pressing his back to a pine. He drew a slow breath, steadying his pulse. Memories clawed at him, nights long ago when he had sworn never again to point a rifle at a man. Nights when the earth had opened to swallow the ones he loved, and the weapon in his hand had done nothing to stop it. But tonight the barrel was not for vengeance. It was for her. For a child whose mother had spoken a prophecy with her dying breath. For chains broken by his hand. The first rider broke through the trees ahead, a dark shape thrashing its way between branches. Gideon lifted his rifle, sighting down the barrel with calm precision. He did not fire immediately. He waited, let the horse stumble over a root, the rider leaned just enough to expose his shoulder. Then Gideon squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the forest like a whip. The man tumbled from the saddle, his cry muffled by snow. The horse bolted, crashing through brush and vanishing into the dark. The shouts behind grew louder. "He's in the trees, flush him out." Another shot split the air, this one close enough that bark sprayed Gideon's cheek. He ducked lower, then moved, circling wide. His boots barely whispered over snow, each step measured, deliberate. These men were loud, careless. They expected him to run in a straight line like frightened prey. But Gideon was not prey. He was the ridge itself, the storm that broke men who thought they owned the world. Two more riders pushed in from the flank. Gideon slipped behind another trunk, heart steady, then pivoted out long enough to fire once, twice. One horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider. The other ducked back, curses echoing though muffled by trees. Gideon didn't linger. He pressed onward, back toward the log where the girl lay hidden. He could not let distance stretch too far between them. Not now. When he returned, she was still there, knees drawn to her chest, eyes searching the dark. Relief washed across her face when she saw him, as though the very sight of him had proven her mother's words true once more. He bent, scooped her up, and pressed her against him. "Hold on," he murmured. She wrapped her arms around his neck and did not let go. He moved again, deeper into the woods, following trails invisible to most eyes. A narrow draw wound its way uphill, hemmed by stone and brush, a path Gideon knew would lead to a ridge overlooked by no man save those born to it. The climb was brutal, snow dragging at his boots, the girl's weight a living reminder of his vow. But he pressed on, every muscle alive with stubborn fire. Behind, voices grew faint, scattered by trees. Still, the chase was not over. These men were too organized to quit at the first loss. Halfway up the climb, the girl finally spoke again, her voice a fragile thread in the cold. "They hurt Mama," she whispered, each word heavy with memory. "She said not to cry, said you would come." Gideon's throat tightened, though he did not falter in his steps. He glanced down at her, strands of her tangled hair pressed against his coat. "What's your name?" he asked gently, needing to give shape to the soul he carried. Her lips parted, her eyes glimmering in the pale light. "Clara," she whispered. Clara. The name sank deep into Gideon's heart, carving itself there as if it had always belonged. He whispered it back, more a vow than a word. "Clara." She closed her eyes, resting against him as though the sound alone was a balm strong enough to ease her fear. The ridge finally leveled, opening onto a shelf of rock that overlooked the valley below. From here, Gideon could see the faint glow of campfires spreading like sickness across the land. More men than he had hoped for. A whole band spread wide and organized. Whoever Clara had been taken by, it wasn't a ragtag bunch of drifters. This was something darker, deeper. Men who traded in flesh, who had laid snares not just for one child but for any unfortunate soul crossing these paths. Clara stirred against his shoulder, her voice trembling. "They'll come again." "Yes," Gideon answered simply, his gaze never leaving the fires below. "But they'll not take you, not while I stand." The wind sharpened, carrying the faint clang of metal from the valley, a hammer striking anvil perhaps, or chains rattling in cruel hands. Gideon's jaw tightened. This fight was larger than he had thought, larger than one child, one rescue. Yet the girl in his arms was no accident. She was a charge, a gift laid upon him by Providence itself. And if her mother's dying breath had spoken truth, then perhaps Gideon Holt had been called out of his self-imposed grave for this very night. He crouched beside a stone outcrop, pulling a blanket from his pack to wrap Clara against the cold. "Rest," he told her softly. "I'll keep watch." She curled into the fabric, her thumb pressing the calico scrap to her cheek, eyes fluttering shut in weary surrender. For a moment, as her breathing slowed, Gideon's chest loosened. She was safe for now. But in the valley below, firelight spread wider, voices rising, more hoofbeats gathering. A storm of men building, waiting for dawn. Gideon knew the hours ahead would decide everything, whether Clara remained free or whether the chain would close around her again. And as the first faint light of morning touched the ridges, Gideon whispered into the wind, half prayer, half vow, "Lord, give me the strength." The trees groaned in the cold, and far below a horn sounded, sharp and commanding. The hunt was gathering again. The horn's call carried through the valleys like the wail of some restless spirit, sharp enough to rattle the birds from their roosts and send Clara's small body stiffening inside the blanket. Her eyes snapped open, fear surging anew, but Gideon's hand was already on her shoulder, steady and warm. He met her gaze with calm steel. "Don't be afraid," he murmured, though he could hear his own heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. "They'll not take you while I breathe." Clara clung to his arm, her thin fingers trembling as she whispered, "They're coming, aren't they?" "Yes," Gideon said simply. He would not lie. He never had much use for lies, and especially not with children whose worlds were already too full of broken promises. "But we'll be ready." He rose, slinging his rifle across his back, and turned his eyes to the fires below. The camp stretched wider than he had guessed the night before. Shapes moved about with purpose, men leading horses, men dragging iron pots from the flames, men checking rifles and pistols. He counted at least 20, maybe more. This was no passing gang. This was an operation, a trade fueled by cruelty. He saw now what Clara had been meant for, and his gut burned with fury. Chains clattered, faint but unmistakable, rising above the crackling of fire. There were others down there, souls locked away, nameless and waiting to be sold like cattle. Clara stirred at his side, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Mama said you'd save me, but what about them?" She lifted one frail hand toward the distant glow of the camp. "There's more." Gideon's chest tightened until it ached. He had thought himself done with the world, finished with its burdens and cruelties. He had buried his wife and son in shallow mountain earth, then buried his heart beside them, vowing never again to risk it. And yet here he stood, a little girl at his side, reminding him that no vow of solitude could erase what God had carved into him, a protector's spirit. Clara's question cut deeper than chains. If he walked away with only her, leaving the others to the fate she had narrowly escaped, what kind of salvation was that? But he did not speak his thoughts, not yet. Instead, he reached down and tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "One thing at a time," he said softly. "First, we get you safe." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, trusting him still. It was that trust that weighed heavier than any chain. The ridge grew colder as dawn began to creep over the peaks, streaking the sky with bruised purple light. Gideon knew they couldn't remain where they were. The hunters would scour the timber come sunrise, sweeping every draw and hollow until no stone was left unturned. He had to move Clara higher into the mountains, where the cliffs grew jagged and the paths narrow enough to favor a man on foot rather than riders on horses. He crouched low, lifting her gently back into his arms. Her head pressed against his chest, and though she trembled, she did not resist. The climb was merciless, the rocks slick with frost, the air thin and biting. Gideon's muscles screamed with each step, his breath ragged, but he did not falter. Clara's weight was featherlight, yet it carried the heaviness of an oath he could not break. With every ledge he scaled, every frozen branch he pushed aside, he whispered a prayer under his breath, not for himself, but for her. For strength to carry her farther, higher, safer. At last they reached a cleft in the ridge, a narrow cave half hidden behind a tumble of stone. Gideon ducked inside, setting Clara gently upon the ground. The space was small, just enough for shelter, the air smelling faintly of pine and damp earth. Clara shivered, her eyes darting to the mouth of the cave. "Will they find us here?" "Not if we're careful," Gideon replied. He laid a hand on her shoulder, firm and reassuring. "Rest a while, I'll keep watch." But Clara did not rest, not yet. She sat there with her knees pulled to her chest, the scrap of calico clutched tight. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, and her small voice broke the silence. "Mama said, if I was scared, I should pray. That prayers are stronger when someone listens. Will you listen?" The words struck Gideon like a hammer. It had been years since he had prayed aloud, years since he had dared believe heaven heard the cries of broken men. But looking into Clara's eyes, he knew this wasn't about him. This was about her, about giving her something to hold when everything else had been stripped away. He knelt beside her, his large hand covering hers. "Go on," he said gently. "I'm listening." Her eyes fluttered closed, her lips trembling as she whispered halting words. "God, please don't let them take me back. Please keep Mama safe in heaven. Please help Mr. Gideon be strong." A tear slipped down her cheek, shining faint in the gray light. Gideon's throat ached, but he bowed his head beside hers, his eyes closing too. For the first time in years, he let the silence of prayer wash over him, not words of his own, but the faith of a child, pure and unbroken. When she finished, she looked up at him as though waiting for something more. Gideon swallowed hard and whispered, "Amen." The girl smiled faintly, her small shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had found her. That fragile smile filled the cave brighter than dawn itself. The peace did not last long. From outside came the crunch of hooves on snow, faint but growing nearer. Gideon's head snapped up, muscles taut. Clara's eyes widened and she pressed herself deeper into the blanket. Gideon motioned for silence, creeping to the cave's mouth. He flattened against the rock, peering through a narrow slit. 3 riders moved along the ridge below, their rifles slung but their eyes sharp, scanning the slopes. They were methodical, searching every hollow, every shadow. Gideon's jaw tightened. If they climbed higher, they might stumble across the cave, and if they did, there would be no escape without bloodshed. He turned back to Clara, whispering low, "Stay here, don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, don't come out." Her lip trembled, but she nodded, clutching the calico tight. Gideon slipped from the cave, moving low and silent across the rocks. He circled wide, climbing above the riders until he stood on a ledge overlooking them. He steadied his rifle, his breath slow, steady. The men rode closer, their leader raising a hand to signal. They were skilled, more disciplined than the fools he'd scattered last night. He could not simply scare them off. The first man dismounted, crouching to study the snow for tracks. His eyes narrowed and he called something to the others. Gideon knew then they had seen enough to know he was near. He tightened his grip on the Winchester, ready to fire, when Clara's voice suddenly echoed in his mind. Prayers are stronger when someone listens. He shut his eyes for the briefest moment, whispering under his breath, "Lord, let me protect her." Then he squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack split the ridge. The dismounted man crumpled, his shout cut short. Horses screamed, rearing back as the other 2 ducked for cover. Gunfire answered, bullets sparking off stone near Gideon's perch. He shifted, firing again, forcing them lower. They cursed and scattered, sliding behind boulders. But Gideon's heart sank as he realized the truth. More would come. This was only the edge of the net tightening. He retreated quickly, slipping back toward the cave. Clara's wide eyes met him as he ducked inside. She flung her arms around him, burying her face into his coat. He held her close, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "We have to move." Outside, voices shouted, more men closing in. Gideon swept Clara up, slinging the rifle back over his shoulder. The mountains would not hide them much longer. The hunters were driving them, tightening the noose, and the only path left was forward, into the teeth of the storm gathering below. As Gideon stepped from the cave, carrying Clara into the bitter dawn, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of drums, or maybe it was just the pounding of hooves. Either way, war was coming, and there would be no turning back. The morning broke with a harsh light, gray and unforgiving, painting the ridges in steel tones. Gideon carried Clara close, his boots crunching over rock and ice as he moved with purpose. The hunters were closing, their voices echoing faint and cruel in the valleys below, but the mountain man did not falter. Each step carried more weight than just the child in his arms. It carried a vow, a prayer, and a reckoning long overdue. The trail narrowed as he climbed higher, the slope jagged with boulders and splintered trees scarred by lightning. Clara's small fingers clutched at his coat, her breath shallow against his chest. She had stopped asking if they were safe. Even at her tender age, she knew the truth. Safety was no longer something given. It had to be fought for. By mid-morning, Gideon reached a plateau, a ledge where the mountain opened onto a vast view of the world below. From here he could see them. Dozens of riders moving with grim discipline, sweeping the forest like wolves hunting a wounded stag. The fires from the night before had dwindled, but their smoke lingered, a dark stain against the sky. And worse, he could see the shapes of others chained at the heart of that camp. Men, women, children, their heads bowed, their movements sluggish. Slaves. Gideon's stomach turned with fury. Clara was not alone. Her mother had died trying to spare her this fate, but countless others had been abandoned to it. Clara stirred, following his gaze. "They'll take them too," she whispered, her voice so small it was nearly lost to the wind. Gideon's jaw clenched as he pulled her closer. He wanted to tell her no, wanted to offer her the comfort of false certainty, but he would not lie. Not to her. Not when her eyes already knew too much sorrow. "They'll not," he said instead, voice like stone. "Not if I have strength left in me." For hours he moved, weaving higher into the peaks, searching for a path, for a place to hide Clara where the hunters could not reach. But the mountains offered little mercy. Every draw seemed to funnel back toward the valley, every pass cut too near the camp below. The hunters had chosen their ground well. Gideon was being herded, whether he admitted it or not. At last he found a break in the cliffs, a shallow hollow beneath an overhang where pine roots jutted from the rock. He eased Clara down, wrapping her in the blanket again. Her eyes were heavy, exhaustion dragging at her, but she fought sleep with stubbornness. "Don't leave me," she whispered, clutching his sleeve. "I won't," Gideon said firmly. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he could not fight this battle alone. He needed help. Yet who in these ridges would stand against such men? Most folks would turn away, too afraid, too beaten down by the weight of power that seemed unstoppable. Gideon's mind turned to a name he had not spoken in years: Abram Cutter. Once long ago, Abram had been Gideon's closest friend, a man of faith and iron who had fought beside him when the frontier was still raw. But tragedy had torn them apart, each retreating into his own grief. Gideon had not seen him in near a decade. Still, if Abram lived, if he still breathed the mountain air, he was the only man Gideon could trust with such a burden. He crouched, brushing Clara's tangled hair from her face. "I need you to be strong," he said quietly, "strong enough to stay hidden for a little while." Her eyes widened. "You're leaving me." "Not leaving, just finding help. I'll come back for you, Clara. On my life I will, you believe me." She studied him, her lip trembling, then nodded slowly. "Mama said you'd save me," she whispered again. Gideon's throat tightened. He pressed his hand to hers, firm and steady. "And I will, but saving you means making sure they can never take you again. That's a fight I can't win alone." Reluctantly, she released his sleeve. Gideon tucked her deeper beneath the overhang, layering pine branches around her hiding place until she was nearly invisible. He showed her how to stay quiet, how to press into the shadows if she heard anyone. Then, with a final glance that seared her image into his heart, he turned and slipped into the timber. The journey was long, each mile shadowed by the hunters sweeping ever closer. Gideon moved like smoke, silent and swift, his knowledge of the ridges guiding him past their patrols. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, bleeding crimson into the peaks. At last he reached a cabin half buried in snow, smoke curling faint from the chimney. The sight stirred something old in his chest. He knocked once hard. The door creaked open, and there he was, Abram Cutter. Broad-shouldered still, though gray now streaked his beard. His eyes widened when they fell on Gideon, surprise and something deeper flashing across his face. "Gideon Holt," he muttered, voice heavy. "Thought you were a ghost." "Not yet," Gideon said grimly, "but I've brought a storm to your door." Abram's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows behind him. "Come in," he said quickly, ushering him inside. The cabin was warm, plain, but cared for. Tools hung neatly, and a Bible sat open on the table, pages worn from use. Abram's gaze returned to Gideon sharp. "Tell me." So Gideon did. He told him of Clara, of the chains, of the men who hunted them, of the camp below where others languished in iron. Abram listened in silence, his jaw tightening, his knuckles whitening on the table's edge. When Gideon finished, the cabin was still, save for the crackle of the fire. At last Abram spoke, his voice low but firm. "You know what this means, don't you? Taking her was only the first step. If we stand against them, there'll be no turning back, not till it's done." "I know," Gideon said. His eyes met Abram's across the firelight. "But I can't turn away, not from her, not from the others." Abram studied him, then nodded once. "Then you're not alone." He rose, crossing the room to lift a rifle from its place on the wall. His hands moved with practiced ease, checking the chamber. "The Lord put her in your path for a reason, Gideon, and maybe He's giving us both one last chance to stand for something that matters." For the first time in years, Gideon felt the weight of his solitude shift. He was not alone. But even as hope flickered, a sound outside shattered it. The crunch of snow under boots, voices low and harsh. Abram stiffened, his rifle already in hand. Gideon's jaw clenched. The hunters had found them faster than he feared. Clara was still hidden in the hollow, but now the fight had come to Abram's door. The handle rattled once. Then a voice sneered from the dark. "We know you're in there, Holt. Hand over the girl and maybe we'll let you crawl out alive." Gideon lifted his rifle, his voice steady as steel. "You'll never touch her again." The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then the door shuddered under a heavy kick. The storm had arrived. The first crash against the door rattled the cabin walls, sending dust from the rafters and shaking the lantern on the table. Abram Cutter's eyes locked with Gideon's, a silent understanding passing between them. This was no time for hesitation. Gideon moved to one side of the door, rifle steady, while Abram took the other, his jaw set, his hand white-knuckled around his own weapon. A second crash splintered wood, followed by a guttural curse from outside. The men were not trying to be subtle. They wanted Gideon to know they were coming, to taste fear before the end. Gideon's heart, however, was not filled with fear. It was filled with fire, with a prayer, with the image of Clara hidden in the mountains clutching her mother's calico scrap. He could not fall here. He would not. The third crash burst the latch free, the door slamming open against the wall. A figure lunged through, rifle raised, but Gideon's shot cracked like thunder before the man could clear the threshold. He fell backward into the snow, his weapon clattering from his grasp. Shouts erupted, boots crunching outside as more men pressed forward. Abram fired next, his shot tearing through the night, the flash illuminating his grim face. Bullets split the air, slamming into the cabin's frame, punching holes through wood. Gideon ducked, dragging the table onto its side, using it as cover. Abram joined him, the two men crouched shoulder to shoulder as the storm of iron raged. The air filled with smoke, wood splinters, and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Still, they returned fire, each shot measured, deliberate. Men screamed outside. Horses shrieked in panic. But more voices kept rising. Too many. "They'll burn us out if we stay pinned," Abram growled, ramming another cartridge into his rifle. Gideon's eyes swept the cabin. The rear wall had a window, narrow and half frozen with frost, an escape but not without risk. He glanced at Abram. "We break through. Circle them wide, lead M away from the ridge." Abram's eyes narrowed. "And the girl?" "She's hidden," Gideon said firmly, though his heart clenched at the thought of Clara trembling alone in the cold. "I'll draw them off. You keep them busy here." Abram's expression tightened, but he gave a single sharp nod. "Don't die out there, Holt, not with her depending on you." Another volley of bullets ripped through the cabin, one grazing the table and spitting wood chips across Gideon's cheek. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reloaded, fired 2 sharp shots through the open door, then bolted for the back. Abram covered him, rifle booming in steady rhythm. Gideon smashed the butt of his Winchester against the window frame, shattering frost and glass, then climbed through into the biting night. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he landed, crouching low against the wall. The shouts shifted quickly. "He's out back," Boots thundered as men broke formation to chase. Gideon darted into the timber, his form vanishing into shadow. Bullets tore into the trees, sparks lighting the dark, but he moved like smoke, silent, quick, relentless. The forest was his blood, his bones, and he knew how to use it. He weaved between trunks, doubled back across his own tracks, using ridges and hollows to confuse pursuit. Behind him, the hunters cursed, their torchlight bobbing like angry fireflies. Still, he could not relax. He could hear them fanning out, methodical, tightening the noose. He had drawn them from Abram's door, but in doing so he had pulled the storm closer to Clara. His heart pounded harder, his every instinct screaming to reach her. He pushed himself faster, lungs burning, legs aching, until at last he crested the ridge above her hiding place. The hollow lay quiet, too quiet. "Clara," Gideon hissed, dropping to his knees, shoving aside the pine branches he had laid across the overhang. His stomach turned cold when his hands met nothing but snow. The blanket was gone, the space empty. For a heartbeat the world stopped, his chest constricted, every breath failing. Then he saw it, prints in the snow. Small, desperate, dragged alongside larger ones. The trail was fresh, leading down toward the valley. Gideon's roar split the silence, low and broken, a sound torn from the deepest part of him. Clara was gone. He slammed his fist into the frozen earth, the sting jolting him back into focus. Rage surged through him, not blind but sharpened like a blade. He rose, following the tracks with deadly precision. The snow told the story clearly. Men had found her, dragged her from the hollow, carried her down toward the camp. Clara's smaller prints were smeared, her struggle marked in every line. The hunt shifted. No longer was Gideon merely fleeing. Now he pursued. He descended the ridge with a ferocity that made the mountain itself seem to tremble. His eyes locked on the campfires glowing brighter in the valley, on the faint echo of chains rattling below. Every step became a vow, every breath a prayer for strength, every heartbeat a promise to Clara and to the woman who had spoken with her dying breath. "Mama said you'd save me." When he neared the valley floor, the sound sharpened. Laughter, harsh and mocking, drifted through the trees. Gideon crept low, crawling to the edge of brush. The camp stretched wide, lit by half a dozen fires. Clara was there. He saw her instantly. She was bound again, this time to a post near the center, her small form huddled, her head bowed. A brute of a man stood guard beside her, swigging from a bottle, while others lounged near the fire, tossing dice, gnawing on meat. But what struck Gideon most was the far corner of the camp. There, penned by iron, were at least a dozen others. Women and children, their faces pale, their eyes vacant. The fury inside him swelled until it nearly consumed him. Clara's words echoed. What about them? He could not take her and leave the others behind. The chains had to break for all of them. Yet he was only one man. Even with Abram, even with his rifle, the odds were impossible. Still, Gideon knew there was no turning back. Providence had led him here. The battle was not his alone to bear. He withdrew into the shadows, his mind working fast. Abram would regroup with him soon if he had survived the cabin siege. If not, Gideon would fight alone. Either way, Clara would not remain in chains. Not tonight. As he crouched there, the wind shifted, carrying Clara's voice faint but clear across the distance. She was crying, her voice breaking, yet the words carried strength far beyond her years. "Mama said you'd save me," she sobbed. The guard laughed cruelly, shoving her back against the post. But Gideon's hands clenched tighter on his rifle, his jaw set like stone. The men around the fire had no idea that death itself crouched in the tree line, eyes burning, waiting for the moment to strike. The camp would sleep soon, and when it did, Gideon Holt would descend like the storm the mountains had raised him to be. Night thickened over the valley, stars hidden behind a low sweep of cloud. The hunters' campfire flared high, sparks dancing into the dark, their laughter rising with drunken confidence. They thought the girl broken, thought Gideon Holt a fugitive fading into the timber. They did not know that he crouched among the rocks above them, every breath measured, every muscle wound tight with purpose. Clara's sobs reached him still, faint yet sharp as thorns against his heart. She was tied to a post near the center of the camp, her small head bowed, her calico scrap clutched in her bound hands. The guard beside her leaned heavy against the post, bottle in hand, his rifle propped lazily within reach. The rest of the men sprawled near the fire, tossing dice, arguing over coin, their voices rough with drink. Chains clattered in the far corner of the camp as the others shifted in their pen, silent but restless. Gideon's jaw locked. He could not leave them. He could not save only one when the Lord had placed so many in his path. Yet to charge blindly was suicide. He needed more than courage, he needed wisdom. He slid back into the shadows, scanning the camp's perimeter. His eyes caught movement, familiar, steady. Abram Cutter. The older man emerged from the tree line, crouched low, his rifle cradled in calloused hands. His beard was frosted with sweat and snow, his eyes hard but alive. Relief surged through Gideon's chest. Abram had survived. They met in silence, crouching behind a fallen log. Abram's hand gripped Gideon's forearm, a wordless bond reforged in the dark. Gideon whispered low, barely more than breath, "They have her, and more." Abram's eyes followed his pointing finger, falling on the chained pen. His face darkened. "Devil's work," he muttered. Then he looked back at Gideon. "What's your plan?" Gideon's gaze returned to Clara. The child's small frame trembled in the firelight, her lips moving silently, praying, perhaps, believing. Her mother's words still guided her even here in the pit of her enemies. Gideon drew in a steadying breath. "We break the pen. Free them all. Use the chaos to take Clara." Abram's brow furrowed. 2 men against 20. Gideon's voice was iron. "The Lord doesn't count numbers, Abram. He counts faith." Abram held his gaze a long moment. Then he nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Then let's be his hands tonight." They moved with the patience of wolves. Abram circled wide, slipping down toward the far side of camp while Gideon edged closer to the pen. The captives inside stirred when they saw him, eyes widening with sudden hope. He pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence. Their chains clattered faintly as they shifted closer to the gate, desperation etched into their faces. Gideon's heart burned hotter. No one deserved to die in iron. He reached the pen, crouched low in shadow. The lock was thick, forged iron meant to withstand force. Gideon slipped his knife from his belt, wedging it against the hasp. He strained, muscles tight, but the metal held fast. Then a hand brushed his arm. He looked up to find a woman inside, her face hollow with hunger but her eyes fierce. She pressed a thin scrap of wire into his palm, her lips mouthing, "Use it." Gideon's chest tightened with gratitude. He worked the wire into the lock, fingers steady despite the roar of blood in his ears. Seconds stretched, the sounds of dice and laughter filling the camp. At last, with a soft click, the lock gave way. The chains slackened. The captives froze, waiting. Gideon lifted a finger, "Not yet." Across the fire, Abram moved into position. Gideon saw the flash of his hand, the signal they had shared in wars long past. On Gideon's nod, Abram fired. His rifle thundered, the guard by Clara collapsing before he could even lift his weapon. Shouts erupted. Men scrambled, their dice scattering into the dirt. Gideon kicked the gate wide, his voice a low growl. "Run when I say." Chaos tore through the camp. Hunters dashed for their rifles, some firing wild into the dark. Abram's shots cracked in steady rhythm, each one felling a man before he could find his bearings. Gideon darted from the pen, cutting Clara's ropes with one swift stroke. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing, her fingers clutching at his coat. "I knew you'd come," she cried against his chest. "You're safe now," Gideon said, though his eyes never left the storm around them. A bullet hissed past his ear, slamming into the post. He swung Clara onto his back, her arms locking around his neck. "Hold on, Clara. Don't let go." He turned back to the pen, shouting, "Now run." The captives surged forward, chains rattling as they stumbled into freedom. Some grabbed weapons from fallen hunters, turning fury into fire. The camp dissolved into chaos, shouts, gunfire, the clash of steel. Gideon fought his way through, his rifle booming, every shot driving a path for the desperate souls fleeing the pit. Clara clung to him, her sobs drowned by the roar of battle. Abram fought like a man reborn, his voice ringing above the din. "Keep moving. Don't stop." Together they carved a path through firelight and blood, dragging the broken and the weak toward the timber. But the leader had not shown himself yet. Gideon felt it before he saw it, the weight of eyes in the dark, the venomous presence waiting for the moment to strike. Then the voice came, smooth and cruel, cutting through the chaos. "You've made a mistake, Holt. She was ours." The leader stepped from the shadows, rifle in hand, his smirk as cold as the steel glinting in the firelight. Behind him, fresh riders poured into the camp, their silhouettes blotting out the flames. Gideon's stomach dropped. The hunters were more than he had counted, more than he had dared believe. Clara whimpered, her arms tightening around his neck. "Don't let them take me back." Gideon's heart hardened. He shifted her higher, his voice low but unshakable. "They won't, not while I stand." The leader raised his rifle, his eyes narrowing. "Then you'll fall tonight." The battlefield stilled. For a moment all Gideon could hear was Clara's ragged breathing, the crackle of fire, and the chains still dragging on the ground. Then the storm broke anew. The firelight painted the snow crimson as the camp erupted into a storm of violence and fear. Gideon tightened his grip on Clara, her arms wound around his neck as though she were clinging to life itself, which in truth she was. Abram Cutter stood at his side, rifle braced, eyes burning with the kind of faith that only came from knowing death might be the price of righteousness. Across the fire, the leader of the hunters raised his rifle, his smirk twisting in the glow. The first shot cracked, a bullet tearing through the air. Gideon twisted, dropping behind an overturned crate, snow spraying as the shot split the log behind him. Abram fired back instantly, his shot true. One of the fresh riders fell from his saddle, crashing hard into the dirt. Shouts rang out, torches waved, the camp alive with chaos. The freed captives scattered, some running into the timber, others scrambling for weapons to fight back. Chains clattered against the ground as the last bonds fell away. Gideon pressed Clara tight against his chest, whispering into her tangled hair. "Close your eyes, don't let go of me." She obeyed, her little fingers digging into his coat, her body trembling but unbroken. Gideon rose, rifle braced against his shoulder, and fired into the oncoming wave. Each shot was measured, steady, not wild fury but deliberate wrath. Men fell, torches dropped, but more pressed forward. The leader advanced with cruel confidence, shouting above the din. "You think you can save her, Holt. You think you can save them all. This land don't belong to men like you. It belongs to power, to us." Gideon's jaw clenched. He fired again, forcing the man to duck behind a wagon, then turned to Abram. "We have to break them here. If we let them scatter, they'll hunt us to the end of the earth." Abram nodded grimly. "Then we stand." The two men fought back to back, every shot echoing through the valley. Abram's voice rose above the chaos, booming like a preacher's cry. "Stand fast, freedom is worth the blood." His words rallied the captives, many of whom turned from flight to fight, their desperation burning into defiance. Women who had been chained just hours before seized rifles from fallen men, firing with trembling hands but fierce hearts. A boy barely older than Clara swung a discarded axe, his eyes blazing with the first taste of freedom. The camp became a battlefield. Smoke curled thick, torches hissed as snow swallowed their sparks. Horses screamed and reared, some bolting into the night, their riders crushed beneath hooves. Gideon moved through it like a storm, his rifle booming, his knife flashing when men came too close. Clara clung to him still, her weight a living anchor to the promise he had made. At last the leader rose from behind the wagon, his rifle aimed squarely at Gideon. "It ends now," he snarled. His shot rang out. Gideon twisted, the bullet grazing his shoulder, hot fire searing flesh. He staggered but did not fall. Clara's cry pierced the night, her tiny voice breaking. "Don't leave me." Her words struck deeper than the wound. Gideon surged forward with a roar, barreling into the leader before he could reload. The two men crashed into the snow, rolling in a blur of fists and steel. The leader was younger, quicker, but Gideon was forged of the mountain, every blow carrying the weight of grief, of years of silence, of a promise made to a dying mother. The knife came free, the leader's smirk faltering as Gideon drove the blade aside and pinned him to the ground. "You'll chain no more," Gideon growled, his voice low as thunder. With one final surge he ended it. The leader's body stilled, his eyes wide with shock, his smirk gone forever. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the ragged breaths of the survivors. The hunters who remained fled into the trees, their courage scattered with their leader's blood. Abram lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, eyes searching the smoke. "It's done," he said hoarsely. Gideon staggered back, lifting Clara into his arms once more. Her tears streaked his coat, but her eyes shone with fierce relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. "Mama said you'd save me, and you did." Gideon pressed his forehead against hers, his tears falling freely. "By God's strength, not mine," he murmured. "But yes, Clara, you're safe now." The freed captives gathered around, their faces weary but alive. Some wept openly, clutching one another. Others simply stared at the broken chains on the ground, scarcely believing they were gone. Abram laid a hand on Gideon's shoulder, his eyes filled with solemn pride. "We've done more than save a child tonight. We've struck a blow against evil itself." Gideon looked at Clara, her small hand still clutching the calico scrap. He thought of her mother, of the faith that had carried the girl through chains and fire. He thought of his own losses, the graves he had left behind. And he knew then that solitude was no longer his path. The Lord had broken his chains too, chains of grief and guilt, by giving him this child to protect. Clara laid her head against his shoulder, whispering one last time, soft as prayer, "Mama said you'd save me." And Gideon, the mountain man who had once lived only for silence, wept openly as he whispered back, "And I will. All the days I draw breath, Clara, I will." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and smoke away. The storm had passed. Chains lay broken in the snow. And for the first time in years, Gideon Holt walked forward not as a man bound by grief, but as a protector, a father, and a servant of a purpose greater than his own solitude. Smoke had thinned by mid-morning, carried off by the mountain winds. What was left of the camp smoldered in silence, fires reduced to embers, chains broken and scattered, the earth scarred by struggle but redeemed by freedom. Gideon stood among the ruins with Clara still in his arms, her small face pressed to his shoulder, sleeping at last. She had not loosened her hold all night, and he had not asked her to. Her faith had carried them both through the valley of death, and now her rest was his greatest victory. Around him, the freed captives began to gather themselves. A woman knelt in the snow, holding her child close as if to never let go again. A boy wiped soot from his face and whispered thanks as he dragged a broken chain into the fire. Others, silent but determined, lifted the bodies of the fallen, laying them out with reverence. They were not just survivors. They were family now, bound by a night no one would ever forget. Abram Cutter leaned heavily on his rifle, his breath still ragged but his eyes alive with the light of something fierce and unyielding. "The Lord was here tonight," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and he didn't forget us." Gideon looked out over the valley, the horizon wide and endless. He had come down from his solitude believing he had nothing left to give the world. Yet the Lord had placed Clara in his path, her voice cutting through the chains of his own grief as surely as he had cut hers. In saving her, he had found himself saved as well. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him with a tired smile, her little fingers still clutching the calico scrap. "We're free?" she asked softly, her voice weak but full of wonder. "Yes, Clara," Gideon answered, his voice steady though it shook inside him. "You're free, and you'll never wear chains again." Her smile widened faintly before she nestled against him once more, drifting back into the deep, peaceful sleep of a child safe in the arms of one who would never let her go. The wind carried the sound of the mountain, pines sighing, eagles calling from their high nests. It was not silence now, not the crushing emptiness that had haunted Gideon for years. It was music. It was life. As the survivors prepared to leave the valley, Abram stepped beside him. "What will you do now?" he asked. Gideon glanced down at Clara, then out at the horizon where the ridges rolled on forever. "I'll raise her," he said quietly. "I'll raise her to know she is loved, to know she belongs to no chains, no cruelty. She'll have a home, my home." Abram nodded, his weathered face breaking into the faintest smile. "Then perhaps the mountains have given back more than they ever took."